The post clerk had already read the letter. Ingrid Solberg could tell by the way his eyes moved to her face instead of his ledger, by the crease where the seal had been broken and pressed flat again poorly. The page inside was damp from rain that had found a seam in the postal bag, and the single sentence written in her husband's cramped hand had already begun to bleed at the edges, the ink spreading into the fiber of the paper like something trying to disappear. Gone where wages are paid in cash. That was all. No address, no promise, no mention of the boy standing beside her in mud-covered boots tugging her sleeve asking if his father had sent candy. People in Hayden said she wouldn't last the winter. They said a woman alone on an exposed claim 12 miles south of town with a sick child and less money than a cord of wood was not a situation. It was a conclusion. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Ingrid Solberg had been carrying something with her since she was 8 years old, packed so deep inside her that even she had forgotten it was there. Not money, not tools, a memory. Her father's hands pressing green spruce tips between two boards in a stone pasture above Voss, Norway, snow filling the gaps between the needles, and his voice low and certain telling her to feel what was on the other side. She would not understand what he had given her until the first snow fell on North Dakota. Before we go any further, if you find yourself in stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who refuse to give up when everything's said to, please consider subscribing. It means we can keep telling them. And this one is just getting started. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September 1887. Ingrid stood in the doorway of the Hayden post office and read it twice. Then she folded it along its ruined crease and put it in her coat pocket next to the stub of charcoal she carried for marking crates. She took her son's hand and walked out into the cold drizzle that had been falling on the town since before dawn. Finn was 6 years old, thin-chested with his mother's pale eyes and a cough that came and went with the wind. He was wearing the same boots he'd worn since June, and the mud had worked its way through the left sole in a seam that Ingrid had repaired twice with pine pitch and would repair again tonight by lamplight. He asked, walking beside her, whether Papa had drawn any pictures in the letter. Ingrid said no. He asked if Papa had written when he was coming back. She said the letter hadn't mentioned it. Finn considered this with the particular gravity of a 6-year-old who has learned that some questions should not be asked more than once. He squeezed her hand instead, and they walked to where the mule was tied, and Ingrid lifted him onto the seat and climbed up after him, and they drove the 12 miles south through drizzle that could not decide whether it was rain or the beginning of something worse. The claim was 160 acres of exposed grassland on the southern edge of the Turtle Mountain timber belt. Peter Solberg had filed the homestead papers in both their names in the spring of 1886, which meant that as a deserted wife, Ingrid could hold the claim, but only if she lived on it. Only if she improved it. Only if the territory decided her presence was sufficient proof of intention. The dwelling was a claim shanty 10 feet by 12 built of single-ply boards. Quarter-inch gaps between them where the pine had shrunk through summer heat. No tar paper on the outside. No saw banking at the base. A tarred canvas roof patched twice where wind had lifted the corners. One sheet iron stove with a cracked elbow joint that leaked smoke when the draft pulled wrong, which it did on every cold morning and most warm ones. Half a cord of cottonwood sat stacked against the east wall. Ingrid looked at it when they arrived home and did not go inside immediately. She stood in the yard in the drizzle with her hand resting on the top of the nearest split log. Cottonwood. Light, fast-burning poor for sustained heat. Half a cord of it. She knew what that meant without calculating it, but she calculated it anyway because clear numbers were a form of discipline, and discipline was the only currency she had left. Peter had left in August with $41, every cent saved from his railroad wages and her laundry work over 16 months. He said Montana paid better. He said he'd send money in 3 weeks. 7 weeks passed. Then the letter. She had $18.75 remaining after flour, beans, and salt pork. 1 sack of flour, 40 pounds of beans, 6 pounds of salt pork. Enough if she stretched it until late November. And Finn would keep growing because children do not stop growing because their fathers leave. Aslak Vraden arrived 3 days later. He was 61 years old, Norwegian-born, a sawyer who had cut timber for half the settlement around Hayden. He had witnessed claims, measured quarter sections, and buried 2 neighbors who froze in the winter of 1884. He came because the post clerk had told the storekeeper and the storekeeper had told Aslak, and Aslak believed it was his business to inspect situations that might become problems before they became disasters. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the shanty, first tapping the boards with the stem of his pipe. Each tap produced a thin, hollow sound like knocking on a shipping crate. He put his eye to a seam between two boards and looked through to the inside where Finn sat on the straw tick drawing shapes in the dirt floor with a stick. Then he came to the door. "One board, Aslak Vreden said." He held up a single finger. "One board between your boy and January. That is not a house, Ingrid. That is a box." She said nothing. She already knew what he was going to say next, because she had said it to herself every night since the letter. He walked the interior without asking permission, the way a man walks through a space he has already decided belongs to a problem rather than a person. He measured nothing with instruments. He measured everything with his eyes, in 40 years of knowing what winter did to insufficient shelter. "Walls," he said. 1 inch of pine with daylight showing. He moved to the roof. Canvas over boards. 2 patches. The first hard wind will peel it back. He opened the stove door and looked inside. Too small. You will need to feed it every 2 hours in deep cold, and it will still lose the fight. He nudged the cracked elbow joint with his boot. "This leaks. You will freeze or choke. Pick one." He stepped outside and stood in front of the woodpile. "Half a cord," Aslak said. "Maybe less. Cottonwood burns fast and cool. A proper winter needs 6 cords of hardwood." 6. "You have enough here for 2 weeks of mild weather." Ingrid followed him outside. The September wind pushed through her wool shawl and found the places where it had thinned. She had mended those places 4 times. There would not be a 5th. "Delivered wood is $3.25 a cord," Aslak said, "plus hauling. That is nearly $20 for 6 cords if you could find a man willing to haul them 12 miles. Tar paper and nails for the walls, another $11. And you would still need someone to drive the nails. You have no ox team. You cannot bank the walls before the ground freezes, which it will do inside a month." He did the arithmetic aloud because he believed in the mercy of clear numbers. He thought if he made the impossibility plain enough, she would make the sensible decision. Other women had. Other women had walked to the stage office and bought passage to relatives in Minnesota or Iowa, and everyone agreed it was the right thing. "Eli Houghton is 1.5 miles east," he said. "If you need help before you leave, she'll come." Ingrid looked at the shanty. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the tree line along the northern edge of her claim, where Turtle Mountain's dense timber darkened the horizon into something that felt less like sky and more like a held breath. "I am not leaving," she said. Aslak pulled on his pipe and said nothing for a long time. Then he shook his head slowly with the particular weariness of a man who has witnessed stubbornness outlast wisdom on enough occasions to have stopped arguing with it. "Then I will see you in the spring," he said. "Or I will not." He left. Ingrid watched his horse disappear into the band of aspen that separated her claim from the Houghton place. Then she went inside and sat on the straw tick beside Finn. And for the first time since the letter, she let herself feel the full weight of the numbers Aslak had stacked against her. 6 cords, $20, $11 she did not have, a stove too small, a roof too thin, walls made of daylight and pine. She had $18.75, a 6-year-old boy with a cough that worsened near smoke, a letter from a man who was not coming back, and a winter that did not care about any of it. The first snow came on October 9th. Not a blizzard. A quiet fall, 2 inches of wet flakes that stuck to everything and melted by noon. Ingrid spent the morning splitting cottonwood with the hand axe, building her half cord into neat rows against the east wall so she could count exactly what she had. Each row measured, each row insufficient. But the snow did something she had not expected. Along the northern fence line where Petter had piled brush the previous spring, tangled willow branches, broken aspen limbs, scrub pine, he had cleared from the fence posts. The snow did not melt by noon. It clung. The open prairie around the pile was bare and scoured by wind within an hour of the snow stopping. The brush pile held its white ridge like a wall. Ingrid set the axe down and walked to the fence. She pushed her mitten through the outer crust of the brush pile and felt the air on the other side. Still. Not warm. Nothing was warm but still. No movement. The wind that pressed against her back and found every seam in her shawl that had been pulling at her since August in ways she could not name, stopped at the tangle of branches and went somewhere else. She stood there for a moment that was longer than it appeared. Then she picked Finn up from where he'd been crouching in the yard watching her, his breath clouding in small, quick puffs, and she carried him behind the brush pile. His coughing, which had begun in the open wind, slowed. The air behind the branches was not warm, but it was still. And still air did not tear at a small chest the way moving air did. She had not thought about Norway in years. It came back to her the way things come back when the body recognizes something before the mind does. She was 8 years old. Standing in a high pasture above Voss on a day when the fog had come down early and her father was checking the stone wall where the sheep sheltered in autumn storms. He had piled spruce boughs against the windward side, not for warmth, not in any direct way, but to show her something. He pressed green spruce tips between two boards and packed wet snow into the needles, tamping it down with his palms until the gaps were filled. Then he took her hand and pressed it flat against the wall behind the boughs. "Feel," he said. Her father's voice, low and certain the way it always was when he was teaching her something he considered permanent. The snow does not move. When snow does not move, it stops being wind. When it stops being wind, it becomes a wall. She had filed that memory the way children file things adults give them loosely without understanding, alongside the smell of resin on her father's palms and the sound of sheep bells in fog. She had never needed it. She had never thought of it as something that could be used. She stood at the fence line and looked at the brush pile, then at the shanty, then at the tree line where the Turtle Mountain timber belt began. Dense pine, spruce, juniper, willow along the creek draws aspen everywhere. Every neighbor wanted it for fence posts, rail ties, firewood, lumber. The timber was not romantic. It was contested fuel. But the tips, the green branches, the small wood, the brush that sawyers threw aside because hauling it cost more than burning it. Nobody held tips. Nobody counted needles. The idea formed the way ice forms on still water, slowly at first, then all at once. She would not try to heat the shanty from inside. She would stop the cold from reaching the shanty from outside. She would weave a wall of evergreen boughs around the cabin thick enough to break the wind, angled to catch snow in millions of needles, and the snow itself would become the insulation. Not fighting winter, recruiting it. That night by candlelight she sketched on a flour sack with the stub of charcoal from her coat pocket. The cabin perimeter was 44 feet, wall height to the eaves 6 feet. She needed the bow envelope, she called it, that in her mind from the Norwegian word for the curve of a hull to be 24 inches thick on the north and west walls, where the killing wind came from 18 inches on the south and east. A 4-inch air gap between the branch mass and the boards. Still air trapped between two surfaces held warmth the way a blanket did. Vertical stakes. 120 aspen or willow poles 7 feet tall, driven 8 inches into the ground, spaced 8 inches apart around the perimeter. Horizontal binders woven between them, peeled willow strips, twisted hay rope. Then boughs. Thousands of boughs. 7,000, maybe 8,000 evergreen tips, each 2 to 3 feet long, woven into the lattice with needles facing outward and downward. Thicker ribs on the north wall every 18 inches to catch drifting snow. The stove side kept clear with a clay-daubed firebreak and a bare earth trench. She knew the dangers. Green boughs could dry, sag, and rot. If the wall collapsed inward, it could trap snow against the boards and soak them during thaw. If she packed it too tight against the shanty, moisture could freeze the door shut. If she left it too loose, wind would strip it away in the first real storm. She wrote the dangers on the back of the flour sack and did not cross any of them out. Finn was asleep on the straw tick with both blankets pulled to his chin and his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm that always worsened when the stove smoke backed up. She watched him for a moment. His right hand was curled near his face, the fingers slightly open, the way small hands rest when their owners have fallen into the unguarded sleep of children who still believe the world will hold. She picked up the charcoal and wrote the first number at the top of the flour sack. 8 inches between stakes. Then the second. 18 inches between snow ribs. Then the third. 4-inch air gap. Willow, not rope. Barton Crail arrived on a Thursday driving a wagon loaded with split oak he was delivering to a farm 3 miles west. He was 44 years old, American-born, a wood hauler, store creditor, and claim speculator who had made his living in the Hayden settlement by being the man people needed when they ran out of options. He sold firewood at $3.25 a cord to people who could pay, and at $5 a cord to people who could not pay until spring. He extended store credit at rates that turned $10 of flour into $16 of debt by March. And when settlers could not pay their debts, he bought their claims at fractions of their legal value. Ingrid's 160 acres interested him. The eastern edge of her claim bordered a timber trail that connected the Turtle Mountain Woods to the main freight road. Control that edge and a man controlled the most efficient hauling route to the railroad. Petter's failure had been visible from the road since August. The letter had simply formalized it. Crail climbed down from his wagon and walked the perimeter of the shanty without asking permission. He counted the boards, the gaps, the woodpile, the tools. He looked at the hand axe, the kettle, the single pair of boots drying near the stove. He looked at Finn playing in the dirt near the east wall and did not smile. Then he made his offer. "I'll forgive your store debt," Crail said, $4.60. "Give you $5 cash on top of that. You sign over the improvements and vacate by December 1st. Ingrid said no. Crail leaned against his wagon. He was not angry. He was patient. He had seen this before, the refusal that came from shock. The pride that would dissolve when the first real cold pressed through single-ply boards at 3 in the morning. "Where will you go," he said, "when it's 30 below and you've got no wood?" Ingrid was sorting stakes she had cut that morning, aspen poles 7 feet sharpened at one end with the hand axe. She set one against the shanty wall and picked up the next. "I won't need to go anywhere," she said. Crail looked at the pile of green branches she had begun stacking beside the north wall. At the stakes already driven into the frozen dirt, crooked, uneven, but deliberate, placed with a spacing that was clearly not random. He looked at the willow switches soaking in the kettle on the stove step. "What is that?" he said. "A wall," Ingrid said. Crail stared at the stakes for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, it was genuine. The laugh of a man who has encountered something so far outside his calculations that his body responded before his reasoning could weigh it. "A wall." He shook his head. "Ingrid, that is brush. That is what I throw behind my shed. You cannot wrap a house in Christmas decorations and call it insulation." Ingrid picked up a willow switch from the kettle. It was warm and flexible. She bent it into a loop, twisted it once, and set it on the ground beside the stakes without looking at him. "A woman alone cannot outbuild winter," Crail said. Ingrid wound the willow around a bundle of pine tips. The bark edge caught her thumb, cutting through the skin. A thin line of blood welled up and mixed with the green resin already on her hands. "Then winter will have to come close enough to prove it," she said. Crail climbed back onto his wagon. He looked at the shanty, the stakes, the green branches, the woman winding willow with bleeding hands. He had the expression of a man filing something away. Not worry, not admiration, but the patient certainty that time and cold would do his negotiating for him. "December 1st, he said. "My offer stands until December 1st. He drove away. Ingrid watched the wagon until it turned onto the freight road. The cut on her thumb was still bleeding. She pressed it against her coat to stop it, and the wool came away with a dark stain that would not wash out before spring. She went back to the stakes and drove 3 more into the ground with the flat of the axe. Each one sunk 8 inches deep. Each one 7 feet tall. Each one part of a design that existed on a flour sack and in a memory from Norway, and nowhere else. By the following week, the settlement had a name for what she was building. Crail told the men at the Hayden General Store, and the men told their wives, and the phrase traveled the way all phrases travel in small communities, quickly, with embellishment, and without mercy. "She is dressing that shack for Christmas," Barton Crail said, leaning on the store counter. "Pity there won't be anyone alive inside to enjoy it." Men laughed. The image was vivid and easy to repeat, a woman tying green branches around a claim shanty like funeral wreaths on a fence post. Children called it the Christmas tree house at the well. A boy Finn's age asked him whether his mother was building a bird nest or a people nest, and Finn said nothing because he did not know. The mockery carried a weight beyond cruelty. It carried a verdict. If Ingrid failed and every practical assessment said she would confirm what the settlement already believed about deserted wives, about immigrants who clung to old country methods, about anyone foolish enough to argue with a North Dakota winter using the scraps a sawyer threw behind his shed. Her failure would be a story told at the store for years. Eli Houghton came 3 days after Crail. She was 32 years old, mother of 3, the nearest neighbor. She came bearing a jar of pickled beets and a question she had clearly been turning over for some time before she arrived. She was not hostile. She was careful the way a person is careful when they suspect they might be about to watch someone drown and cannot decide whether reaching out their hand is kindness or interference. "Aslak says you told him you were staying," Eli said. Ingrid was sharpening the hand axe on a flat stone. "I'm staying. He says the shanty won't hold. I know what the shanty will do. He says you need 6 cords and you have less than 1. I know what I have." Eli set the beets on the step and watched Ingrid work the axe edge. She waited for the explanation. Ingrid gave her one not in words but in action. She set the axe down and led Eli to the brush fence along the north line, the old pile of willow and scrub pine that Petter had cleared from the fence posts in the spring and never hauled away. "Put your hand here," Ingrid said. She pressed Eli's mitten into the crusted snow that still clung to the tangle of branches 11 days after the first squall, while the open prairie on every side had been blown clean. "Now here." She guided Eli's other hand into the open wind beside the fence. Eli felt the difference. Her face changed. Something moved through it that was not quite belief and not quite dismissal. She pulled both hands back and shook her head. "This is not Norway," Eli Houghton said. She picked up one of the green boughs Ingrid had cut that morning and shook it over the ground. Needles scattered across the frost. "Prairie wind doesn't ask permission. These needles will dry and fall in a month. The wind will strip the lattice bare. Snow will melt against the boards and rot them. And the work, Ingrid, the work alone will use you up before the first real storm." Eli's objections were not cruelty. They were the same objections Ingrid had written on the back of the flour sack and not yet answered: drying needles, stripping wind-rotting boards, labor that outpaced one set of hands. She had not crossed them out because crossing them out would be dishonest, and dishonesty with yourself in a situation like this was the luxury of people who had somewhere else to go. "I know," Ingrid said. "Then why?" Ingrid looked at the tree line. She looked at the shanty where she could see Fenn through the open door sitting on the straw tick, turning the stub of charcoal over in his small hands. "Because tar paper costs $11, she said. "Delivered wood costs $20. I have $18 and a boy who coughs when the wind comes through the walls. I cannot buy my way out. I cannot leave. The only material I have in any quantity is the thing growing half a mile from my door that every man in this settlement throws away." Eli looked at the tree line, then at the fence. Then at Ingrid's hands already roughened from 3 weeks of axe work and willow cutting the knuckles dry, and cracked the thumbnail on the right hand dark from where the axe had glanced. "I think you're wrong," Eli said. "But I brought beets." She left the jar on the step and walked back toward her claim. Ingrid watched her go. Then she picked up the axe. She had 6 weeks before deep cold. Maybe 7 if the season ran mild, which no one expected and she did not count on. The north wall was 32 feet long. It needed to be the thickest. She would start there. By October 20th, she had 40 stakes in the ground along the north wall. The line was not perfectly straight. She had no surveyor's string, only her eye and a charcoal mark on the shanty boards, but it was close enough. She began the lower weaving. She laid horizontal willow binders between the stakes at 12-inch intervals, pressing evergreen boughs into the lattice with needles facing outward and butt ends toward the cabin. Each bough had to be pressed tight enough to hold its neighbor, but loose enough that snow could find its way into the gaps between needles. She learned the difference on the 3rd day when a gust from the northwest caught a section she had packed solid and pulled 6 boughs free in a single breath. The branches scattered across the yard. Fenn watched from the doorway and said nothing. Ingrid gathered the boughs, repacked them looser, and lost the rest of the daylight doing work she had already done once. By the end of October, the north wall was woven to shoulder height. 32 feet of green lattice smelling of pine resin and wet bark, leaning slightly toward the shanty like something pressed there by an unseen hand. She stood back and looked at it. From the road, it looked exactly like what Crail had said, a brush pile leaning against a toy house. But when she walked behind it and pressed her palm flat against the shanty boards, she felt what Aslak and Crail and the men at the store could not feel from 12 miles away. The boards were dry. The wind noise was lower. The air between the boughs and the wood was still not warm. Nothing was warm but still. And still air, her father had said, is the first thing winter has to defeat before it reaches you. Ingrid pressed her forehead against the rough pine boards. She could hear the wind moving through the stakes on the other side. She could smell resin and frozen dirt, and the faint sweetness of crushed needles. She was 29 years old, alone, exhausted, and building something she had seen work once in a different country, against a different winter, in a memory she could not be fully certain she was remembering correctly. But the boards behind the north wall were dry, and the boards on the unprotected south side were rimed with frost. She picked up the axe and walked toward the tree line. She needed 300 more boughs before dark. Her hands were bleeding again at the old cuts. The bark of the aspen stakes reopened, the same places every day now, and the pine resin that sealed them also stained them dark, so that her palms held a map of every hour she had worked. Fen called from the doorway, "Mama, will the branches win?" She did not answer, not because she didn't hear him, because she did not yet know. She kept walking toward the timber, the axe at her side, the flour sack outline folded in her coat pocket, and the numbers she had written there, 8 inches, 18 inches, 4 inches, already as familiar as her own name. The north wall was not finished. The west wall had not been started. And the worst of what was coming had not yet shown its face. But she was walking toward the trees, and the boards behind her were dry. That had to be enough for today. The north wall collapsed on November 2nd. Not all of it. The upper third of the center section, 12 feet of woven boughs that Ingrid had finished 2 days earlier, working by lamplight until her hands could no longer feel the willow switches. A wet snow had fallen overnight, heavier than the October dusting, and the weight had settled into the lattice and pulled the horizontal binders downward by morning. The hay rope she had used to tie the upper courses had stretched. The boughs sagged, then slumped, then slid off the stakes in a slow green avalanche that left a gap wide enough for Fen to walk through standing upright. Ingrid stood in the yard and looked at the damage. 2 days of work on the ground. Her hands were cracked across every knuckle, the skin split at the creases, where the cold and the axe handle had done their work over 6 weeks. The flour sack in her pocket was nearly half empty of beans. The west wall had not been started. The south wall had not been started. The door tunnel, the angled entryway she had sketched on the flour sack that would keep drifting snow from packing straight through to the door, existed only as a charcoal drawing. She knelt in the mud and began pulling wet boughs from the pile, trying to sort the salvageable from the ruined, retying them with the same hay rope that had already proven it would not hold. A voice came from the trail. "You are trying to tie a wall." The voice was unhurried, neither warm nor cold. "Tie a basket instead." Birta Neseth stood at the edge of the yard. She was 63 years old, and she moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago that the body has a fixed number of movements in it, and each wasted one is a debt. Her cane was peeled birch worn smooth at the grip. Her coat was patched at both elbows with different fabric, neither patch matching the other or the coat. She had come from the timber from the dugout, half a mile into the tree line, where she had lived for 11 years since her husband died of pneumonia in his second Dakota winter, and left her with a claim she could not sell, and a low-ceilinged room she had learned to keep warm by other means. She did not offer her name. She did not explain how she had come to be standing at the edge of Ingrid's yard on a November morning. She walked to the collapsed section and picked up one of the boughs Ingrid had tied. She held it up and shook it. The hay rope slid off like water off a board. "Rope pulls straight," Birta said. "Straight pull has no grip. When the weight comes, the rope stretches and the branch slides." She dropped the bough and crouched beside Ingrid's kettle, which was sitting on the stove step with willow switches soaking in warm water. She lifted one out, bent it while it was still pliable, twisted it once at the center, and hooked it over a stake. Then she let it sit. The willow cooling began to grip the wood on its own, tightening as it dried rather than loosening. "Willow grips as it dries," Birta said. "It tightens instead of stretching. You do not tie a wall with rope. You weave it with wood." Ingrid watched the loop contract around the stake. She had been using rope because rope was what she had. She had not thought about what happened to rope under wet snow load. She had thought about what happened to the boughs, to the stakes, to the air gap. She had written the failure modes on the back of the flour sack. But she had not thought about the ties. "I do not need charity," Ingrid said. Birta looked at the north wall, the lower 2/3 still holding the upper third on the ground, the stakes standing bare and useless above shoulder height against the November sky. I did not offer charity, Birta said. I offered a correction. You measured, you cut, you marked the wall. Your mistake is in the binding, not the design. Lazy work I would leave alone. She sat on the chopping block and began heating willow switches in the kettle, bending each one while it was warm, twisting them into binding loops that she lined up on the ground like a row of small green rings. Ingrid watched the first 3. Then she made the 4th herself. Birta checked it without speaking, turned it once in her fingers and set it with the others. They rebuilt the collapsed section in 4 hours. Birta showed Ingrid how to alternate the butt ends and needle ends of the boughs so the lattice locked under its own pressure, thick branch against thin bending. Thick holding the whole mass compressing when loaded rather than sliding. She showed her the outward lean, the upper edge of each section tilted slightly away from the shanty so that the weight of snow pressed the wall into the stakes instead of through them. The wall must lean, Birta said, always outward. If it leans in, the snow pushes it through your cabin. Before she left that afternoon, she lashed a short crosspiece of willow horizontally across 2 stakes, 18 inches below the top edge of the rebuilt section. A small ledge barely wider than a hand, jutting from the face of the lattice. Snow ribs, Birta said. Every 18 inches on the windward side. The snow catches here instead of piling at the base. The wall fills from the top down. By January, the whole north face should be solid white. She turned to leave, then stopped. Keep a hand's width between your boughs and your boards, she said. Still air warms. Wet wood dies. If the boughs touch the cabin, moisture will freeze the boards from the outside in and rot them before spring. She walked back toward the timber with her cane tapping on frozen ground. Ingrid watched her go and realized she had not asked Birta why she had come, whether Aslak had sent her, whether Eli had mentioned the collapsed wall to someone who mentioned it to someone else. The settlement ran on exactly that kind of chain information, traveling mouth to mouth faster than any wagon. But it did not matter. What mattered was that the willow loops held when Ingrid tested them that evening, pressing her full weight against the rebuilt section until the stakes flexed and the boughs compressed, but the lattice did not give. What mattered was the snow rib catching the first light dusting of the next morning, holding a thin white line while the ground below it stayed clear. What mattered was that she could measure the hand's width gap with her fist, and her fist was a tool she always had with her. Birta came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She did not move in. She walked the half-mile from her dugout each day, arriving when the light was strong enough to see knots, leaving each afternoon before the shadows made the trail uncertain for a woman with a stiff leg. She brought nothing except her hands and her knowledge, and once a piece of dried fish that she split with Fen without asking Ingrid's permission. Fen ate it without asking what it was, which was the right response, and Birta nodded at him once, which was her version of approval. The work entered a rhythm. Ingrid cut boughs in the mornings. 300 a day was the target, 250 was the reality. She hauled them on a canvas drag that Birta rigged from a flour sack and 2 aspen poles so the load moved behind her like a slow wake through the snow rather than having to be carried. Fen sorted willow in the yard, separating straight from crooked in bundles of 10, which kept him moving and the cough at bay. Birta sat near the wall and wove binding loops, corrected angles, watched the weather with the attention of a woman who had read 11 Dakota winters from inside a dirt room. Birta taught through action. When she spoke, it was in corrections, not explanations. When she was silent, the silence meant the work was right. Her 5th lesson was the most important. Around the stove wall, the south-facing section where the chimney pipe exited through the canvas roof, Birta insisted on a different standard entirely. No boughs within 16 inches of the pipe. A collar of clay plaster mixed with sand from the creek, draw packed into the gap between the pipe and the roof canvas with her thumbs until it was solid. A bare earth trench scraped clean 3 feet wide, running the length of the stove-side wall. A piece of scrap tin from a ruined bucket hammered flat and nailed as a heat shield between the stove elbow and the nearest stake. The man who sells wood, Birta said, not using Crail's name because she did not need to, will call this a fire trap. He will say green boughs around a stovepipe will burn your boy alive in his sleep. She pressed clay into the collar thumbs, working in slow circles. He is not wrong about the danger, she said. He is wrong that the danger has no answer. Ingrid understood. The fire discipline was not just safety. It was a defense against the argument that would be made when the method began to work, and she had already begun to believe in the way the body believes before the mind catches up that it would work. The axe handle broke on November 14th. Ingrid was splitting an aspen pole for stakes when the wood grain gave way at the throat. The head buried itself in frozen dirt. The handle was hickory brought from Minnesota, and there was no replacing it without a trip to the Hayden General Store, where the only replacement handles belonged to Barton Crail, kept behind the counter at $1 each. Ingrid had $16.20 left. She could not spare $1 she could not spare, but she could not drive stakes or cut boughs without the axe, and she had 4 weeks of construction remaining and 3 walls unfinished. She walked to the store. Crail was there. He saw her come in and knew why before she reached the counter. The look of someone who has come to spend money they cannot afford is a look that men who sell things on credit learn to recognize before the door finishes opening. $1, he said. Ingrid set a small cloth bag on the counter. Inside was her last coffee. A 1/4 pound of beans she had been saving since September, rationed to 2 cups a week. Coffee was worth 60 cents a pound at Hayden prices. A 1/4 pound was 15 cents. She had brought it because it was the only thing she possessed that Crail wanted and could not get more easily elsewhere. "That is not $1, Crail said. "It is all I have that you want," Ingrid said. "You don't drink chicory, you drink coffee. I know, because your hired man buys it by the pound every 3rd week, and you have not been to the store yourself for any." Crail looked at the bag. He looked at Ingrid. The exchange had nothing to do with coffee, and both of them knew it. It was about who could afford to refuse, and Crail, for the first time since August, found that the calculation did not resolve as cleanly in his favor as he was accustomed to. He took the bag and gave her the handle. Ingrid fitted it to the axe head in the storeyard, tightening the wedge with a stone, and walked home without looking back. The cut on her thumb from 3 weeks earlier had healed into a ridge of scar tissue white against the darker staining of pine resin. She pressed it against the new handle as she walked, feeling the grain of the hickory, and thought of nothing except the stakes waiting to be driven. 3 days later, Finn collapsed. The fever came fast, 1 hour. He was sorting willow in the yard the next. He was on the straw tick, with heat pouring off his skin, and his cough deepened into something that shook his whole small frame. Ingrid banked the stove boiled water, wrapped him in every blanket she owned. She burned a full day's worth of cottonwood, keeping the shanty warm enough for a sick child, and she did not touch the walls. 1 full day. Half her remaining wood supply now measurably closer to nothing. Birta came that evening without being sent for. She sat with Finn, held his hand, while Ingrid went back outside in the dark with the lantern and drove 11 more stakes along the south wall line. The frozen ground fought every stroke. By the 9th stake, her arms were shaking badly enough that she missed the pole on the downswing and drove the axe flat into frozen dirt. She pulled it free. She kept going. Finn's fever broke the following morning. He was weak and slept most of the day, but by afternoon, Ingrid brought him outside, wrapped in a blanket, and set him on the chopping block in a patch of thin November sun so he could watch her work. He watched her wind a willow loop around a stake, press a bundle of pine boughs into the lattice step back, press them again. "Why are the branches going around the house?" he asked. "So the wind has to argue with them before it argues with us," Ingrid said. Finn thought about this for a while. "Will the branches win?" Ingrid pressed the next bundle into the lattice and did not answer. Not because she was avoiding the question. Because she had learned in the weeks since October that the honest answer was not yes or no, but something more complicated, something closer to, "I have given them every advantage I know how to give, and now we wait and see what they do with it." She kept weaving. Her hands moved without her having to think about the movement anymore. Reach, press, twist, tighten the way. Hands move when a task has been done enough times that the body memorizes it and the mind can be somewhere else. She was somewhere else often now. In the flour sack numbers, in the memory of the Voss pasture, in calculations about bough counts and stake spacing and how many willow ties Birta had woven that morning versus the day before. On November 22nd, Crail closed the wagon trail. The trail ran through a strip of his leased ground between the freight road and the timber edge. Every settler in the area used it to reach the Turtle Mountain woods for firewood fence posts and building material. Crail had never charged for passage before. Now he posted a man at the entry with a hand-lettered notice hauling rights 50 cents per load. The timing was not accidental. Ingrid needed 200 boughs a day for the remaining 3 weeks of construction. Without the wagon trail, she could not get the canvas dragged through to the nearest stands of pine and spruce. She could carry boughs on her back through the open ground, but open ground in late November meant wind and distance that would cut her daily count by more than half, and she could not afford 50 cents she did not have. This was the moment she understood it clearly, standing at the notice with her breath clouding in the cold when Crail expected her to run the arithmetic and arrive at his offer. December 1st, $9 and the debt forgiven. 72 acres of timber trail access included in the transaction. Birta heard about the closure before Ingrid returned home. She was at the shanty when Ingrid arrived, sitting on the chopping block with her cane across her knees. She listened without expression as Ingrid described the notice, the posted man, the 50-cent charge. Then Birta stood and said, "Come." She led Ingrid north along the claim boundary past the stands of wild plum and box elder that marked the edge of Crail's lease, and into a section of aspen that grew thicker as the ground rose toward the first real timber. A deer trail wound through the aspen, barely wide enough for a person dragging a canvas bundle threading between trunks that stood so close together a wagon could not have passed, but a canvas drag could. Barely. Matey freighters used this 20 years ago, Birta said, before the freight road was cut. It adds a quarter mile each way and the creek crossing will be dangerous after thaw, but it does not touch Crail's ground. Ingrid walked the trail's length, measured it with her pace, noted the creek crossing solid now but uncertain come March. She began using the deer trail the next morning. Each trip took 40 minutes longer. Each trip produced fewer boughs because the narrow path limited the size of the drag. But each trip was free, and free was the only arithmetic that mattered now. Eli Houghton came at dusk on November 28th. She brought her 2 oldest boys in a sled loaded with willow bundles she had cut herself that afternoon, and her jaw was set in the particular way that meant she had been arguing with herself for several days before arriving and had only recently lost the argument. "I'm not here because I believe in your wall," Eli said. She stood in the yard with her arms folded against the cold, looking at the shanty, which had now grown a full green envelope on the north side, a partial wrap on the west, and scattered stakes marking the south and east lines. "I'm here because Fenn should not pay for what his mother decided." Ingrid said nothing. Eli's boys hauled willow and stacked boughs while Eli herself wove a section of the east wall under Ingrid's direction. She was clumsy at first, her loops too loose, her boughs packed butt-end out so that needles faced inward instead of outward, which was exactly backwards and would have let wind pass straight through. But she learned the way Ingrid had learned by doing it wrong, having it corrected with 3 words instead of 10, and doing it again. They worked by lantern light for 3 hours. The temperature dropped steadily as the night came on, and their breath made small clouds above the lattice as they worked, 2 women pressing green boughs into a growing wall that the settlement had decided was either foolish or useless, or both. Eli stepped back and looked at the section she had completed. "It is ugly," she said. "It does not need to be beautiful," Ingrid said. "It needs to be thick." Eli looked at it for another moment. Then she picked up another bough. They finished the east wall that night. By December 21st, the bough envelope was complete. North wall 24 inches thick. West wall 26 at the corner where the wind hit hardest. South wall 16 inches, east wall 18. Door tunnel 3 feet of brush-lined passage angled away from the northwest so that drifting snow would have to turn a corner before reaching the door, and snow driven by wind does not turn corners well. Chimney clearance 16 inches of bare clay scrap tin and scraped earth exactly as Birta had specified. Final count, approximately 7,400 boughs woven into 118 stakes, bound with 290 willow ties sealed with 4 clay patches around the stove side. From the road, the shanty had vanished. In its place stood a squat green mound with a black chimney pipe rising from its crown and a narrow dark opening where the door tunnel began. It looked less like something that had been built than something that had grown from the ground, a form shaped by accumulation rather than construction, the way a snowdrift is shaped by wind rather than intention. It looked, as Crail had predicted, like a Christmas tree that had swallowed a house. The first real snow came on December 26th. 6 inches in 2 hours, driven by a northwest wind that scoured the open prairie and piled drifts against anything standing higher than grass. The bow wall caught the snow the way Birta had said it would. The ribs held. The needles gripped. By morning, the north wall was white from the first snow shelf to the eaves, and the lattice beneath the white crust had stopped moving in the wind. That night the temperature dropped below zero for the first time. Ingrid burned 3 armloads of cottonwood and waited. In the old configuration, single-ply boards, no banking the sheet, iron stove fighting the cold alone, 3 armloads would have held the interior above freezing for perhaps 4 hours before the heat bled through the walls and the stove demanded more. Ingrid knew because she had lived through October that way, feeding the fire every 2 hours, waking in the dark to find frost on the inside of the boards and ice in the water bucket. She woke at midnight and checked the thermometer Aslak had lent her, holding it near Finn's bed. 42 degrees. The water bucket had a thin skin of ice on top but was liquid beneath. She reached behind the stove and pressed her palm against the inside of the north wall boards. Dry. Not frosted. Dry. 3 armloads instead of 6. 42 degrees instead of 28. It was not victory. 42 degrees was cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to sleep in your coat, cold enough to keep a child under 2 blankets. But it was alive in the specific way that matters most when you have been told something will not survive. Finn woke briefly and asked if the branches were winning. Ingrid tucked the blanket more firmly around his shoulders. "They are not losing," she said. "That is enough for tonight." January 12th, 1888 began warm. Strangely warm. The kind of warm that made men leave their coats on hooks and open doors to air out rooms that had been sealed since October. Snow dripped from branches. Ice loosened on the creek. The sky was blue in a way that felt extravagant after weeks of the flat, white gray that had become the season's only color. Birta arrived at noon. She did not explain why. She stood in the yard and looked north where the horizon met the Turtle Mountain timber in a dark line that seemed somehow lower than usual, closer, as though the sky were pressing down. She leaned on her cane and breathed with an attention that suggested she was reading something in the air that had no name in English and possibly not in Norwegian either. "Bank the stove," Birta said. "Fill every pot. Close the tunnel. Bring the boy inside now." Ingrid did not ask why. She knew Birta well enough by now to understand that when the old woman gave an instruction without explanation, the explanation was that there was no time for one. She called Finn from the woodpile. She filled the water bucket, the kettle, and 2 tin pots from the creek. She banked the stove with the heaviest cottonwood she had, closed the draft halfway so the fire would burn slow and hold its heat without consuming itself. She dragged a bundle of boughs across the tunnel entrance and packed snow against them. By early afternoon, the northern horizon had changed. The blue was gone. In its place was a band of color that had no precise name, not cloud, not fog, but something between them, the color of dirty cream pressed against the underside of the sky. A color everyone on the northern prairie knew without having been taught it, the way certain smells carry information that bypasses thought entirely. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 20 minutes. Then the wind arrived. It did not build the way storms usually build, rising in stages, snow beginning as flurries and thickening over hours. It arrived all at once like a wall coming down. One moment the air was still and the yard was visible, and the chimney smoke rose in a straight column. The next moment the world was white and screaming, and the wind was not wind anymore but a physical weight pressing against everything vertical and trying to flatten it. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontal at a speed that made it look solid, a moving wall of white that struck exposed skin like sand. The first impact against the north wall was a sound Ingrid had not heard before. Deep and soft at once, a heavy compression like something large pressing against a surface that yielded slightly and then held. The shell held. The second impact was harder. The third was not an impact at all, but a continuous, sustained pressure, and the boards of the shanty creaked inward with it, and the candle flame leaned toward the south wall and stayed there, bent by something finding its way through seams too small to see. Ingrid stuffed rags into the gaps around the doorframe. Birta sat on the straw tick with Finn and counted stove clicks, the small metallic ticks the sheet iron made as it expanded with heat, because the counting gave the boy somewhere to put his attention. 112. 113. Then the west corner began to fail. Ingrid heard it before she could see it. A rhythmic sound beneath the roar of the storm, something striking the outside wall at intervals. Not wind, which was constant and formless. This was structural, specific, something loose. She pressed her ear against the west boards and felt as much as heard it, a brace. One of the diagonal aspen supports at the corner joint. A willow tie had worked loose under the sustained pressure, and the brace was swinging against the stakes with each surge of wind. If it pulled free entirely, the storm would catch the edge of the west wall lattice and peel it back like the skin of fruit, and the west side of the shanty would be open boards in the worst blizzard anyone within 100 miles had yet seen or named. "I have to go out," Ingrid said. Birta looked at her. Her face in the stove light was difficult to read, but her eyes were the same as they always were, steady. Present, not warm exactly, but not without warmth either. "Rope around your waist," Birta said. "Tie the other end to the door beam. Take willow loops, not rope for the brace. And do not let go of the wall." Ingrid tied a length of hay rope around her waist and knotted the other end to the beam above the door. She put 3 willow loops between her teeth because she would need both hands. She pulled the bow bundle back from the tunnel entrance and crawled into the entry. The wind found her before she reached the tunnel's end. It came through the gaps between the tunnel bows and hit her face with a force that closed her eyes and filled her nose with snow. She could not breathe facing north. She turned her head south and took air in sideways tasting ice and pine resin and the dry cold that is its own specific flavor, not like any other cold. She reached the tunnel exit and the full storm took her. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was no horizon. There was only white, moving at a speed that made it feel solid, and the wind that drove it pressing her sideways against the wall, and the rope at her waist going taut as the storm tried to separate her from the thing she had built. She crawled along the base of the wall with her left hand gripping the stakes, counting them by feel, 8 inches apart, every one of them exactly where she had driven them. Her right mitten froze to a wet willow tie, and she pulled it free and lost a strip of wool from the palm. Her bare skin touched snow-packed boughs and stuck briefly, and she pulled that free too and felt the sting of torn skin across her knuckles. The brace was at the corner. She found it by the sound, and then by touch the aspen pole swinging in a short arc, still attached at the base but free at the top, opening a gap in the lattice with each swing that let the storm into the structure. She hooked the first willow loop over the top of the brace and around the nearest stake. Twisted it once. Pulled. The loop held. But the brace was still loose at the midpoint, swinging in a smaller arc now, but swinging. She took the second loop from her teeth, reached higher. The wind pushed her sideways and the rope at her waist snapped tight and held, and she leaned into the pull and got her arm above shoulder height and lashed the brace to the stake at midpoint. The swinging stopped. She crawled back along the base of the wall, following the rope with her hands, when the tunnel entrance disappeared into the white, hand over hand, until her fingers hit the bow bundle. She pulled herself inside, dragged the bundle back into place behind her, and collapsed on the dirt floor with her cheek against the frozen earth. Her left hand was bleeding. Her right mitten was gone. Her face was raw, and her eyelashes were frozen together, and she could not feel her feet, and she did not know yet whether the loop she had tied in the dark and the wind at the angle she had not been able to see would hold through the night. Fenn's voice came from the straw tick, small and steady in the roaring dark. 247, 248. Birta put Ingrid's bare hand into a fold of her coat and held it there without speaking. Outside, the storm pressed against the north wall, and the north wall pressed back. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the first night, Ingrid could not tell whether the willow loops she had tied in the dark were holding. She could only sit with her back against the south wall, her bare left hand wrapped in a strip of Birta's underskirt, and listen to the storm press against the north face of the bow wall, with a sound like the sustained note of something enormous and indifferent. The candle had blown out during her return through the tunnel. She did not relight it. She sat in the dark and counted Fenn's breaths the way Birta counted stove clicks, not because counting helped, but because it gave the mind something to hold while the body waited. The west corner was silent. That was the first thing she knew. No rhythmic striking, no structural complaint from the brace she had lashed in the white and screaming dark. The corner was silent, which meant the loops were holding, which meant she had done the one necessary thing correctly, even when she could not see her own hands. She pressed her palm against the inside of the north wall boards and felt what she needed to feel. Dry. On the second day, the wind shifted from northwest to north. This was worse. The north wall was the thickest 24 inches of woven boughs beneath a snow shell that had been compacting since December. But the shift meant the wind was hitting it head-on, its full force concentrated along the longest wall rather than glancing across the corner. The boards creaked. A fine line of snow powder found its way through a seam near the floor and drew a white thread across the frozen dirt. Ingrid packed it with rags and a smear of the bacon grease she had been saving for the pan. The thread stopped. Birta made Finn breathe through a damp cloth when his coughing worsened in the changed air pressure and the thickened stove smoke. The coughing slowed. He slept. On the second night, Ingrid checked the thermometer by the light of the banked stove. 54 degrees near Finn's bed. 62 near the stove. The water bucket was liquid. She had burned less than a quarter cord in 2 full days of the worst storm the northern plains had produced in living memory. A storm that was, though she did not yet know this, killing cattle in open fields 10 miles east, freezing a schoolteacher's horse in its traces on the timber road, and driving a child into a snowbank outside an unlocked schoolhouse door 8 miles away who would not be found until morning. The bow wall was no longer a lattice. The storm had packed snow into every gap between every needle on every bough, until the entire north face was a single frozen mass, snow and green compressed by sustained wind into a shell that the wind itself could no longer penetrate. The wall had become what Birta had said it would become. The snow had stopped moving. When snow stopped moving, it stopped being wind. When it stopped being wind, it became a wall. The candle flame, which had been bent toward the south wall since the storm began, stood upright for the first time on the second night. Birta saw it and said nothing. She only reached out and touched the inside of the north wall boards with the flat of her hand, the same gesture Ingrid had made on the first day. The green lattice reached shoulder height, checking for what the boards could tell you that no thermometer could. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she folded it back into her lap. "Dry," Ingrid said. Birta nodded once. The storm broke on the afternoon of the third day. The wind dropped over the span of an hour from a roar to a moan to a sound like slow breathing, and then to a silence that was louder than anything the storm had produced. Ingrid opened the tunnel entrance and crawled out into a world remade entirely white and bright and still. Snow was piled to the eaves on the north side. The bow wall had disappeared beneath a shell that curved over the roof edge like a frozen wave. The stakes were buried. The willow ties were buried. The 7,400 boughs she had cut and hauled and woven across 6 weeks of autumn were locked inside a solid mass of compacted snow that would not melt until April. The chimney pipe rose from the white mound and smoked quietly into air that was cold and clean and absolutely calm. Ingrid walked the full perimeter. The corner brace she had fixed in the dark and the wind and the blindness held. The door tunnel was clear. The angled entry had done exactly what the flour sack sketch had promised, turning the driven snow aside so that the door behind it could open without ice. The fire trench around the chimney base was clean, the clay collar intact, the scrap tin heat shield in place. Every precaution Birta had taught was visible in the aftermath. The outward lean that had let snow compress instead of crush the snow ribs, that had caught drift before it could pile at the base, the breathing gap that had kept the boards dry while the world outside turned to ice. She stood in the yard and looked at what she had built. It did not look like a house. It looked like a hill. A white hill with a chimney and a narrow, dark mouth where the tunnel began sitting on the flat, scoured prairie, as though it had grown from the ground rather than been placed on it. It looked, she thought, like something that belonged there, like something that had always been there and would be there long after the people who built it were gone. She was standing there when Reuben Maher crawled through the tunnel entrance. He was Crail's hired hand, 26, quiet from Ohio. He had been caught on the timber trail when the storm descended, had unhitched his wagon and tried to ride south toward town. The horse had refused. It had turned east and walked with its head down through snow that reached its belly, and Reuben had lain flat against its neck and let it choose because the horse could not see any better than he could, and at least the horse was not panicking. The horse had walked toward a shape, in a whiteout that had swallowed every fence post, every tree, every building in the settlement, in a featureless blanket of horizontal white that extended in every direction without feature or edge. The bow wall's snow shell was a contour, a difference, a place where the white had shadow and mass and form. Everything else had been erased. The green mound was visible because it was thick enough to be visible because 7,400 boughs packed with compacted snow made a shape that wind could not flatten into the prairie the way it flattened everything else. The horse walked toward it and stopped. Reuben fell from the saddle and crawled along the base of the wall until he found the tunnel. He pushed through and collapsed on the dirt floor, blue-lipped, shaking, his fingers white at the tips. Birta put his hands in warm water. Ingrid wrapped him in the blanket she had been sleeping in for 3 days. He did not speak for an hour. When he finally did, he looked at the walls of the shanty, the boards that were dry on the inside, the thermometer that read 51 degrees, the water bucket that had never frozen solid, and he said I could see the shape of it. In all that white. Nothing else. Just the shape. He said it the way a man says something he will spend a long time thinking about afterward. The settlement counted its losses within a week. One child at a schoolhouse east of Hayden let out early because the morning had been warm. 3 of the Grindheim cattle. A horse frozen in the traces on the timber road. Frostbite taking parts of 11 people, fingers, toes, the tip of a nose, the upper curve of Aslak Vraden's right ear, and the last joint of 2 fingers on his sawyer's hand. Aslak came to the claim 4 days after the storm. He rode slowly because his bandaged hand could not grip the reins with the same sureness it once had, and he dismounted in the yard and stood before the snow-covered bow wall for a long time without speaking. Then he walked its full length, running his unbandaged hand along the outer face, letting the needles that still protruded through the snow shell prick his palm. He knelt at the base of the west wall and found the corner brace, the one Ingrid had lashed in the dark. The 2 willow loops she had tied by feel alone, and examined how they had frozen solid, underload, and gripped the stake now with a strength that was indistinguishable from iron. He came inside and stood near the stove. I was wrong about the wall, Aslak Vraden said. He said it the way a man who has measured things for 40 years says something he has measured and found to be true plainly without drama, because drama would diminish the precision of it. But I was not wrong about winter. That is why this matters. He asked to see the west corner brace. He asked about the willow ties, how they were heated, how they were twisted, how they tightened instead of stretching. He asked about the snow ribs and the breathing gap and the outward lean in the order a builder would ask, moving from structure to detail to finish. Then he pulled a small notebook from his coat, the kind sawyers use for board feet and timber orders. He opened it to a blank page, and at the top he wrote 2 words in his careful hand. Solberg Wall. You should write it better than I can, he said. But I will write it first, so it exists somewhere other than a flour sack. Eli Houghton came the same week. She walked into the yard in the late morning and stood in front of the east wall, the section she had helped weave by lantern light in November. Clumsy at first, her loops too loose, her bows backwards, and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The storm had packed it solid. Her own work was indistinguishable now from Ingrid's encased in white part of the whole. My door froze shut on the second night, Eli said. I burned the table. Then I burned a chair. My youngest was on the floor in a drift that came through the threshold gap. She paused. She was not a woman who paused often. Your door opened every morning, she said. Then she asked Ingrid to show her the tunnel again. The angled entry, the slight bend that made drifting snow turn a corner before it reached the door. She walked through it twice, crouching, pressing her hands against the woven walls, the way Ingrid had pressed her hands against the brush fence in October, learning by touch what the mind needed time to believe. I want this for my door, Eli said. The north face, the tunnel. I don't need the whole wall. Not yet. Then come tomorrow, Ingrid said. Bring the boys and Willow. Eli looked at her. She left without saying anything else, which was Ingrid had come to understand the way Eli Houghton expressed most of what mattered to her. 6 families came to the claim in the 2 weeks that followed. 2 bachelor claimants from south of the freight road who had survived the blizzard burning furniture and wanted the arithmetic explained. A matey freighter who asked whether a half wall could protect a calf shed. A widow named Ingrid Solberg who walked 4 miles through crusted snow to see the wall, not to ask technical questions, but to stand in the yard and look at the green mound and say, I thought this was something only a man could build. Ingrid showed her the flour sack with the charcoal sketch, the numbers and measurements and margins, and on the back the list of failure modes that she had not crossed out. She showed her the willow loops that Birta had taught, and the blistered ridges across her own palms, and the scar on her right thumb where the bark had cut through in October. Hands built this, Ingrid said. Not a man's hands, not a woman's hands. Hands. She refused payment from everyone who came. Most of them had nothing to offer anyway. Instead, she asked one thing: anyone who learned the method must help the next household weave at least one wall. The knowledge was not hers to sell. It was hers to pass. Then came the twist Ingrid had not anticipated. Not from the storm, not from the cold, from Crail. He arrived the following week not to the claim but to the land office in Hayden, where he filed a complaint stating that Ingrid had been stripping boughs from timber ground assigned to licensed haulers. The boughs, he argued, were marketable wood product. By taking tips from leased timber, she had been stealing from men who had paid for hauling rights. The complaint was weak, and he knew it. The boughs were tips. Fallen limbs brushed too small for rail ties or fence posts, the kind of material sawyers left where it fell because hauling it cost more than it was worth. Birta knew exactly what a sawyer's leavings looked like. She had watched the matey freighters sort timber for 20 years in these same woods. She walked to the land office with Ingrid and told the clerk in detail the difference between commercial timber and brushwood waste. The clerk listened. He looked at Crail. Crail looked at the floor. It was not fuel, Ingrid said quietly. That is what you never understood. The distinction mattered. The boughs were not burned. They were woven. They did not replace wood. They reduced the need for it. Crail left the land office without speaking. He did not make the complaint again. What he did instead arrived 2 weeks later, early on a Tuesday morning. 2 wagon loads of scrap poles delivered to the schoolhouse yard. Aspen and willow sorted by length, stacked clean. Enough material to wrap the schoolhouse east wall, which had been left bare the previous autumn for lack of material. No note attached, no name on the delivery. Reuben Mayer, who drove the wagon, said only that he had been sent. Everyone in the settlement understood what the poles meant. Barton Crail's conversion was not a speech. It was lumber. Birta Nesseth died on March 14th. The pneumonia came fast, the way it comes for people whose lungs have been damaged by years of smoke and low-ceiling rooms in Dakota cold. 1 week she was splitting willow in her dugout, working by the light from the low door, her fingers moving through the green wood with the same precision they had moved through it all winter. The next week she was on her back with a fever that turned her breath into a sound Ingrid recognized and could not name. Ingrid walked through spring mud every day for 5 days. On the 3rd day, Birta asked her to bring Finn, and the boy sat beside the old woman's bed and counted not stove clicks this time, but the drips falling from the dugout's thawing roof, one every few seconds, irregular and patient. On the 5th day, Birta's breathing stopped between one drip and the next as quietly as a door closing in another room. Ingrid found what was under the folded shawl afterward. A small knife worn thin from years of splitting willow ties. The handle darkened with resin, the steel still carrying the faint smell of smoke and wet bark. And beside it a bundle of pre-twisted willow ties, enough for one wall panel, bound with a loop that Birta must have made the day before she could no longer sit upright. The loops were perfectly formed. Each one heated, bent, twisted at the center, dried to the precise tension that would grip a stake and tighten rather than loosen under load. She had made them when she could no longer stand. She had made them knowing she would not use them. Ingrid carried the knife and the bundle home. She put the knife on the shelf above the stove where the warmth would keep the handle from cracking. She hung the bundle from a nail near the door where the air moved and the willow would cure without splitting. Fenn asked where Birta had gone. Into the timber, Ingrid said. Because that was true in every way that mattered, she did not add to it. They buried Birta on the hillside above her dugout where the aspen grew thickest, and the snow was always the last to melt in spring. Aslak carved the marker. Eli brought food. Ingrid stood at the grave after the others had gone, and the wind moved through the bare branches above her and made a sound she had heard 1,000 times without listening to the sound of air meeting wood and being turned aside, deflected, redirected, sent somewhere else without violence, without the wood breaking or the wind stopping, each one changed slightly by the encounter with the other. She stood there until the cold reminded her that standing still was its own kind of risk. Then she walked back down the hill toward the claim, toward the green mound that smoked quietly in the March air, toward the boy inside who was almost certainly sorting willow by the stove and counting something. Halvor Dahl arrived in the settlement that spring, driving a freight wagon loaded with carpenter's tools, and Aslak sent him to the claim because Aslak had learned to recognize men who understood wood as behavior rather than material. Halvor was 36, widowed, quiet, in the way that people are quiet when they have been loud with grief for a long time and have arrived at something on the other side of it. He came to see the wall. He walked its perimeter the way Aslak had, but slower, stopping where Aslak had not, at the roofline, where the bow lattice met the canvas at the eaves. The roofline is a problem, he said. It was the first thing he said to her, and it was a criticism. And he said it the way someone says a thing they have decided deserves to be said, regardless of how it is received. Ingrid crossed her arms. The roof line holds. It holds now, Halvor said. But in spring the melt runs off the snow shell and drips behind the lattice at the eaves. The water sits on the canvas. In 2 years you will need a new roof. She had noticed the drip line. She had not solved it. What would you do, she said. He took charcoal from his pocket. Carpenters carry charcoal the way other men carry tobacco, and sketched on the cabin wall. A hinged frame. Aspen poles bolted to the top stakes with pin joints. In winter the frame folded down against the lattice and the boughs packed around it. In spring you pulled the pins and the frame swung out, making a 3-inch overhang above the eaves so meltwater dripped forward instead of behind. The overhang blocks the airflow at the top of the breathing gap, Ingrid said. Warm air rises inside the gap and exits at the eaves. If you close the top, the warm air stays and condenses on the inside of the boughs. Halvor stared at his sketch. He erased a line with his thumb and redrew it. Slotted frame, he said. Gaps every 6 inches across the overhang. Water drips forward through the slots. Airflow continues. Ingrid looked at the revision. She nodded. Then teach my hands, Halvor said. It was not a phrase that fit the settlement's understanding of how knowledge moved between people. But Halvor said it because he meant it, and because he was a carpenter who had just met a better design than his own and understood that the way to learn a thing properly was to build it with someone who already knew it in their hands. They built the slotted frame together over 2 days. Halvor cut the joints. Ingrid set the pin spacing. They argued about the hinge mechanism. Halvor wanted iron pins. Ingrid wanted wooden dowels that could be replaced without a forge, and compromised on iron pins with wooden backups stored inside the tunnel. They tested the frame by pouring water along the roof line from a bucket and watching where it went. Most of it went forward. That works, Halvor said. That works, Ingrid said. They looked at each other across the roof line with the particular expression of 2 people who have discovered that disagreement conducted honestly can be a form of trust. They married in the spring of 1891 in a ceremony that Aslak witnessed and Eli catered and Finn attended, holding a willow wreath. Halvor had woven a circle of green switches twisted with the same technique Birta had taught, the ties tightening as they dried the whole thing, holding its shape, not because it had been forced into it, but because the wood had been given the right conditions and allowed to find its own way there. By 1892, 23 households in the Hayden settlement used some version of the bow wall. Not all were full wraps. Some had only a north face. Some had only a door tunnel. Some had half walls on barns and calf sheds. But every version used the same principles. Willow ties, outward lean snow ribs on the windward face, breathing gap clay collar around the chimney, bare earth fire trench, removable summer panels. The schoolhouse had a full removable winter windshell that went up in October and came down in April. The teacher reported his firewood consumption had dropped by nearly half. Aslak kept the measurement notebook. The first page still said Solberg wall in his sawyer's hand. By the 3rd year, it had entries from 14 different households, each with notes on local variations, adaptations, failures, and refinements. A living document of a living method, growing the way any real knowledge grows, by being used by people with different problems in different places until it becomes something larger than what any one person intended. Finn survived childhood. His cough faded as he grew into the drier air of the new house Halvor built in 1893. Proper timber frame saw banking at the base glass windows that did not frost white by morning. He attended the bow-wrapped schoolhouse and learned arithmetic from a teacher who no longer burned furniture in February. He grew tall and precise and quiet like his mother. And when he was old enough to hold a charcoal stick without breaking it, he began writing the spacing rules on the schoolhouse wall each November. 8 inches between stakes. 18 inches between snow ribs. 4 inches of air gap. Willow knot rope. He wrote them in the same careful hand every year until he became the teacher himself. Ingrid Solberg kept Birta's knife on the shelf above the stove in the new house, in the same position it had occupied in the old shanty. The handle darkened further with years of stove heat. The blade wore thinner. She used it every autumn to split the first willow ties of the season, and every autumn the steel carried its faint smell, smoke and wet bark and pine resin, as though the old woman's dugout lived on somewhere inside the metal, patient and specific, refusing to be entirely gone. She lived on the original claim until 1926. 39 years on the same ground she had nearly lost in the autumn of 1887, when a man with a wagon and a ledger had done the arithmetic aloud and concluded that she had none left. She outlived Petter, who was found in a Montana boarding house in 1903 with no money and no letter. She outlived Krail, who sold his store in 1898 and moved to Bismarck, where no one knew him by name. She outlived Aslak, who died at 84 with the measurement notebook still on his shelf, filled now to the last page with other people's numbers. She did not outlive the wall. Every November, until her hands stiffened too much for willow, she walked the old stake line, the place in the yard where the first shanty had stood, where the coals of the original stakes were slowly rotting into the earth. She checked each one, pressed her palm against the ground near the base of each rotting post. Halvor said she did it from habit. Fenn said she did it from stubbornness. Ingrid said winter respects habit. Those two are not different things. After she died, the first snow of that season settled in the old stake line before it settled anywhere else in the yard, as if the ground still remembered the shape of what had stood there, still held the memory of all those autumns in its cold, dark patience. The shanty itself was long gone by then. The bow wall was long gone, but the spacing remained pressed into the earth by years of posts and ice and slow spring thaw, a kind of writing that no charcoal could make and no weather could entirely remove. 8 inches, 18 inches, 4 inches. Barton Krail had been right about one thing. She had dressed that shack for Christmas in the autumn of 1887 with green boughs and willow switches, and the particular desperation of a woman who had no other material and a child who needed to be kept alive. The men at the store had laughed, and the sound of it had carried through the settlement for weeks. But the green wall that looked foolish from the road became the shape people searched for in whiteout. The needles that were supposed to dry and scatter held snow. The snow that was supposed to bury her became the thing that kept the wind away. And the woman, who was supposed to fail by December 1st, was still walking that stake line in November of 1925, her breath clouding in the cold, her hands pressed flat against the frozen ground, checking. She had not fought the winter. She had studied it closely enough to understand what it needed, and then she had given it exactly that, a place to stop, a surface to fill a shape, to pack its weight against. And in doing so, she had turned it season by season into the very thing that kept her alive. The wind, finding the wall, went somewhere else. It always does when something understands it well enough to offer it a better path.